It's Tuesday evening in the Mon House Hotel. The two main function rooms are full of people attending dinner dances. Including the staff, there's around 450 people in the hotel. There was a jovial atmosphere as the attendees ate and socialised. The starters had just finished when the bomb went off. The massive fireball shattered the windows and filled the Peacock function room, burning many people alive, charring their bodies beyond recognition. Though these type of bombs had been used before, this was the first time this napalm-like substance detonated into a room full of people. It was truly a horrific attack, and it was a huge misstep for the paramilitary group responsible. This is the story of the Mon House Hotel bombing.
This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland.
Just a heads up, folks, that this episode has some graphic descriptions of burn victims. So if that is something you are sensitive to, I would recommend maybe giving this one a miss. It's 1978 in Northern Ireland. The blanket protests in the Maze prison are underway as Republican prisoners demand to be treated as political prisoners and not ordinary criminals. In 1977, the Provisional IRA had ramped up what was known as incendiary attacks, which were attacks targeting businesses around Belfast and Derry. These attacks were designed to burn buildings to the ground and usually tried to avoid civilian casualties. On November 4th, 1977, there were 25 different incendiary attacks around Belfast and Derry. Then on the 11th, there was another attack on Gallagher's tobacco factory in Belfast. Then on November 24th, a mother had purchased a baby blanket from a shop in Belfast. She brought it home and unwrapped it and discovered an incendiary device inside it, which was presumably meant to detonate in the shop. December 1977 saw the IRA increase the frequency of their bombings. IRA bombs exploded on December 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 8th, 13th, 14th, 20th and 21st. There were also gun attacks and killings going on during this period. On December 21st, 5 hotels around Northern Ireland were damaged from IRA fire bombs. Then, on December 22nd, the Provisional IRA announced a Christmas ceasefire, which lasted until January 12th, 1978, with the killing of a UDR soldier. The Provisional IRA has constantly faced accusations of being sectarian, that they were targeting the Unionist population. They would say that they weren't, and that their attacks were targeting members of the security services or businesses and infrastructure in Northern Ireland, hoping to bring the Northern Irish economy to its knees. Despite these claims, in the period between 1974 and 1976, 91 Protestant civilians would lose their lives. The Provisional IRA justified these killings in a statement saying, quote, "The Irish Republican Army has never initiated sectarian killings. But if loyalist elements responsible for over 300 sectarian assassinations in the past 4 years stop such killing now, then the question of retaliation from whatever source does not arise." In late 1976, IRA leadership met with loyalists and it was agreed to halt random sectarian killings and car bombings of civilian targets. This agreement remained in place until 1979 in the wake of the Warren Point bombing. But it was the attack at the Mon House Hotel in 1978 which made the Unionist population feel like the Provisional IRA were marked with a sectarian stigma. The Mon House Hotel is located in the town of Comer in the Northern Irish county of Down. It's around 6 miles away from Belfast City. It's a mid-sized hotel which was once a farmhouse dating back to 1794, with 2 sizable function rooms which are suitable for large gatherings of people. It's a hotel far from what would have been considered Republican areas and was seen as somewhat of a safe location, hidden away from the horrors of the Troubles. And it was here on February 17, 1978, where 2 groups were holding their yearly dinner dance. The Irish Collie Club, which is a club dedicated to the dog, the Border Collie, and then the other group was the Northern Ireland Junior Motorcycle Club. Both of these groups were full of people enjoying an evening of dinner and dancing. While the members of the Irish Collie Club were in the Peacock Room enjoying their starters, no one noticed what was happening just outside the window of the room. A 45-pound bomb had been placed in a holdall, which is basically a small rectangular luggage bag. This bomb was composed of a detonator, a close-peg trigger, a travel alarm clock as a timer, and then a pound of homemade explosives. Surrounding these explosives were 4-gallon tins filled with petrol, and according to one of the bombers, each tin had around 2 pounds of sugar added into it, which would make the fire stick to surfaces and burn longer. The bomb was either placed on a windowsill or attached with a meat hook to the window. The 30-minute timer was set, then the men disappeared off into the night. There were around 450 people in the hotel when the bomb detonated. The bomb went off and vaporized the canisters around it, shattering the windows of the hotel and causing a petrol fireball 12 metres high and 18 metres wide. It caused absolute devastation in the Peacock Room, but also travelled through the rest of the building. Those nearest to the explosion were instantly killed, and witnesses described the bombing as like a scene from hell or watching the sun explode in front of you, as people fled from the hotel with their clothing and hair still on fire. Here are some witnesses talking about being in the room when the bomb went off.
The bomb went off and it came like a ball of fire, just from the bottom of the room right up the centre. It just looked like a huge ball, big orange ball.
My friend, she was just charred. There was nothing there.
I remember looking over to my right and there was a dance floor laid on the floor for that purpose, and there were all these flames all over it, and I remember thinking at the time that it was beautiful because they were all different colours and they were all about 2 inches long and they were just dancing all over the floor. And then all of a sudden self-preservation took over. I realised if I didn't get out of this I was going to die, and people were just pushing and shoving and everyone was trying to get out, and they would have walked over you to get out. And I reached where the kitchen door was and I passed out then. But luckily I passed out and fell into the kitchen out of the room. When we got out, we went into the big function room, and there was another girl there. She had a long dress on her with a zip right down the back, a metal zip. And the zip was it was burning into her back. And she got her husband to lift a carving knife off one of the tables and cut the zip out of her because it was just hurting that much.
Initially, in the wake of the attack, it was reported that children were killed. But this was because what was left of those killed to identify were small charred remains. Such was the intensity of the fire. Firemen arrived at the hotel within 8 minutes, and it took them 2 hours to put out the blaze. Assistant Chief Fire Officer Sammy Moore spoke of the blaze, saying, quote, "When a fire is started by a ball of flame, it starts a very fierce fire as the building construction heats up to ignition point in a short length of time. This drives oxygen from the atmosphere, and quickly you get a tremendous blowtorch effect, with flames rolling off the top and fresh air coming in from the bottom. At Le Mans, a type of firestorm was created with the wind appearing to rise near the building. I have never witnessed this in a single-storey building before." After the fire was eventually extinguished, it was then time to assess the loss of life. In total, 12 people were killed, with 30 others badly injured, suffering extreme burns and some losing limbs. It's hard to really convey the horror of this attack. Some of the victims were still receiving medical attention up to 20 years after the attack, and many of those killed were charred beyond all forms of recognition. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Around 100 detectives were put on the case. They had 3 aims. First was to identify the dead, then to figure out which type of bomb was used, and then to try and find the killers. The dead and wounded were taken to the Ulster Hospital in Dundonald, and it's here where one of the doctors described what it was like seeing the bodies. Just a heads up, this account is quite graphic.
Lying on the floor of the ambulance were what looked like 3 charred logs, about 4 feet long, maybe a couple of feet wide. And at first I just didn't register what they were. So I went over and I touched one, and my finger went into, I suppose, 1.5 inches deep. And I suddenly hit something hard, and I realised that this was a human being. But it was quite unrecognisable as such. So I rapidly closed the door and went out and inquired what the other 2 ambulances contained. And I was given to understand that it was the same thing.
It was very important to take extreme care and make sure that they were identifying the correct person. It was easy to tell who didn't make it out of the hotel alive, but much, much harder to tell whose remains were whose. In some cases, they couldn't even tell the gender of the dead. A squad of detectives worked with forensic scientists to work on establishing this, and Reverend Roy McGee also worked with families to help identify their loved ones.
On this Saturday, I spent quite a lot of time trying to get samples of clothing, of hair from brushes, dental records, so that it would help the forensic people with identification. But when I arrived at the mortuary on the Saturday afternoon, the inspector who was in charge of the case invited me to come in. I think he wanted to let me know just that what I was doing was almost a meaningless exercise. When one went into the mortuary and saw what had been a short time before human beings.
The Belfast Telegraph reports that one woman was identified by a ring that she wore, another by a buckle on her artificial leg. One was identified by a tuft of hair found on the body, which was matched up with the hair on her pillow and hairbrush at home. Others were matched by comparing blood groups with living family members. The last woman was impossible to identify. There was simply nothing left. She was identified due to the process of elimination, so she could be no one else. Of the 12 people killed, 3 were married couples. The victims were Thomas Neeson, 37, Paul Nelson, 37, Dorothy Nelson, 37, Daniel McGill, 37, Carol Mills, 26, Gordon Crothers, 30, Joan Crothers, 26, Sarah Cooper, 52, Christine Lockhart, 33, Sandra Morris, 27, Elizabeth McCracken, 25, and Ian McCracken, 25. In the case of 25-year-old Ian McCracken, he survived the initial blast, but grabbed a torch from the receptionist and went back into the hotel in search of his wife Elizabeth. He subsequently perished in the blaze. Before this bombing, the Ulster Hospital would occasionally get one burn victim at a time from a fire-related accident. But in this case, they had to help the many victims who were suffering from severe burns, and it proved to be a very difficult task. It took around 5 days, but eventually all the victims were identified. Dorothy and Paul Nelson were amongst those killed, leaving their 2 teenage daughters orphaned. Here's one of their daughters, Andrea, talking of the night.
I was babysitting next door and was watching the last news bulletin and saw that there had been a fire at Le Mans. Well, I didn't think any more of it. But then the people I was babysitting for came home and said that Mum and Dad had been there. This really didn't mean much because I thought they'd be safe. And then as the night went on, they didn't come home and there was no news of them. Reverend McGee, he arrived at the house to see if they had come home under their own steam, as it were, and they hadn't. So we sat up all night, really just waiting for some news. And in the morning realised that they hadn't come home, they weren't in hospital and they weren't going to come home. But they were trying for a whole week to positively identify my mum and dad. And from what I remember, it was by a process of elimination that the identification was made.
Jim Millis lost his wife Carol and sister Sandra in the attack. He still remembers his last words to his wife before the bomb went off. Quote, "She was really fond of salt on her food. I told her that all that salt was going to kill her. Little did I know that she could have taken all the salt she wanted that night." Of the survivors, Lily McDowell was the most seriously injured. Half of her body was covered in 3rd and 1st degree burns. She spent the next 5 years in and out of hospital getting skin grafts done. It was extremely painful, and there were many times where she had nervous breakdowns. Here's an account of what happened to Lily on the night. Quote, "She still remembers the dress. It was a shimmering sea green silk, the most beautiful garment she'd ever owned. She bought high-heeled silver sandals, like nothing she usually wore, and had her hair done. I'd never been to a dinner dance before, so I made a big effort. I thought it would be a very special night." Lily then described what happened after the bomb went off. "Beside us, a girl's hair caught fire, and Billy took off his jacket to try and put it out. I lost my grip on him. I tried to escape by myself. I got down on my hands and knees, crawling along the floor. But then my way was blocked. I didn't know what by at first, but then I felt them. The dead bodies. I tried to climb over them, but I couldn't, so I turned and went the other way. I'd inhaled so much smoke I could hardly breathe. My hair was on fire and I was badly burned. I thought I was dying. Please God, let Billy live so there's someone to take care of our sons. I tried to say the Our Father. I'd been saying it since I was a wee girl, but I couldn't remember the words. Then a voice in my head told me to be calm and try again. It all came back to me. I said the last amen and passed out. Lily was dragged unconscious out of the Peacock room. Lily passed away at the age of 72 in 2013. And her husband Billy died in September 2024. After the dead were finally identified, next came the task of figuring out what type of bomb was used. The IRA had used these bombs in more than 100 attacks on commercial buildings around Northern Ireland in the past, but never like this, a no-warning bomb. Fire officer Alex Withers described the bomb as something more likened to napalm used in Vietnam. Investigators ended up staging their own explosion to see if they could replicate a fireball so large. There was also some small debris recovered from the bombing, which gave them an indication as to the type of bomb used. So who were the bombers? The Provisional IRA issued a statement one day after the explosion, admitting responsibility and apologising for the inadequate warning. The bombing was universally condemned by Republicans, but to the Unionist population, this was seen as an indiscriminate sectarian attack. There were calls for a return of the death penalty, and one Unionist politician called for Republican areas to be bombed by the Royal Air Force. Northern Ireland Secretary Roy Mason got a lot of flack in the wake of this bombing, with some believing that he was being complacent with regard to his attitude towards the IRA. There were protests in Belfast, and the international airport closed for an hour as a mark of respect for the victims. It was hard to hide the universal disgust felt by this attack. In an effort to track down the bombers, and perhaps to shock members of the public into helping identify the killers, the RUC released posters featuring a photo of the charred remains of one of the victims. The poster read, "Murder, murder, murder. This is what the bombers did to a human being. Murder, murder, murder." It's quite a graphic image, and the posters were eventually withdrawn after relatives discovered whose body was depicted on the poster. The investigation into the bombing began immediately, and within hours of the attack, 30 alleged Provisional IRA members were arrested. Jerry Adams was also arrested, accused of IRA membership, as was Eddie Brophy, who was believed to be the leader of the Provisional IRA's cell at Turf Lodge in Belfast. Adams was eventually released. Brophy was also released, but was arrested again 2 years later. This time he faced 49 different charges, some of which being the Mon Hotel Bombing. He had signed statements admitting his involvement after days of interrogation at the Castlereagh Holding Centre. Brophy claimed that these statements were only signed under extreme duress after he was beaten up by RUC detectives. After an 11-week trial, it was found that his admissions were forced and the charges against Brophy were dismissed. Brophy spent the next few years of his life living under the radar, until he came to the attention of Johnny Adair and his infamous C Company. A 2-man hit squad went to Brophy's workplace. One man entered and shot Brophy a number of times before jumping in a getaway car and disappearing. Brophy was shot several times, including in the neck, and his life was saved by a passing nurse who applied a tourniquet to his neck. The Sunday World reports that in a tragic twist of fate, this nurse had actually lost her son to an IRA bomb years earlier, and now she had saved the life of an alleged IRA bomber. Brophy died of natural causes in 1997. The other man who was eventually charged for the Le Mans bomb was Robert Spud Murphy. Murphy was the man tasked with hijacking the car used in the attack. He had let one car go because he knew the driver, but then eventually secured a small Fiat. Murphy was handed down 12 life sentences after he admitted manslaughter for those who died at Le Mans. He was jailed in 1981, then released in 1995, before dying of cancer in 2006. So the question remains, why did the Provisional IRA target this hotel? Well, for one, the Mon House Hotel was a known Unionist establishment, and this fed into the Provisional IRA's narrative of causing destruction and chaos to businesses in Northern Ireland. But more importantly, it's believed that the IRA were operating on faulty intel. They thought that they were targeting RUC officers who were meeting in the restaurant that night. But this meeting actually occurred a week before the night of the bombing, and there were no members of the security services at the hotel on the night of the bomb, just primarily Protestants enjoying their evening. So why was there no warning placed to authorities before this bomb went off? For that, we'll need to go back to the night of the bombing. What we know is that on the night of February 17th, a bomb was given to IRA members in the Turf Lodge housing estate in Belfast. It was then transported the 30-minute drive to the Le Mans Hotel in the hijacked Fiat car. Other Republicans drove ahead of the bomb car to scout for security checkpoints. The men in the scout car were picked because they knew the area quite well, unlike the men in the bomb car. The car then made its way into the car park at Le Mans House Hotel unnoticed, while the scout car waited outside the car park. At around 8:30, a 30-minute timer was set on the bomb, which was then placed on the windowsill outside the Peacock Room. The men then left the car park. They were then to find a payphone and call in the bomb threat. This next part is a direct account of one of the alleged bombers. As they left the car park, they realised that the scout car had disappeared. The alleged bomber continues, quote, "We hadn't a clue where we were. There were no streetlights or signposts, and we didn't even know whether to turn left or right. We seemed to be driving for ages, and all the time we knew the timer was ticking towards the explosion." After travelling for some time, the men realised that they drove in the wrong direction. Quote, "We realised that we were in Saintfield. We had driven in the opposite direction, but we still desperately wanted to telephone a warning. But there was only one phone box in the village, and it was broken. We had no option but to head back towards West Belfast." With the timer on the bomb counting down, the men needed to find another payphone, but they were then delayed when they came upon a UDR checkpoint. They weren't searched, but the queue of cars delayed them a couple of minutes. By the time they reached the next telephone box, they had only 9 minutes before the bomb would detonate. This wasn't nearly enough time to raise the alarm. The warning call was placed to the Newton Ards RUC base. They ended up receiving 3 warning calls regarding the bomb at 8:57, 9 and 9:04. An officer then immediately phoned the hotel to give the warning to evacuate, but upon phoning he realised he was too late, as he received a response saying, quote, "For God's sake, get out here, a bomb has exploded." That account came from an article written in the Sunday World in 2022. In that article, Hugh Jordan wrote that one of the bombers reached out to him to set the record straight. The bomber said that he bitterly regrets the loss of life. Quote, "I'm going through a very bad time and I can't get Le Mans out of my mind. It just shouldn't have happened. I wanted to speak out now to let people know the full story. The loss of innocent life was wrong and it should never have happened. The place was supposed to have been evacuated. No one should have died at Le Mans. It was selected as a target because it was a well-known Unionist establishment. I placed an incendiary bomb on the window grille. 2 other bombs were also set and petrol was used to provide a fire boost. I personally added 2 pounds of sugar to each bomb." The unnamed bomber who spoke to the Sunday World said that they were then kicked out of the IRA for what they did at Le Mans, but he believes that it was the scout car's fault. Quote, "We were dismissed from the IRA for bringing the organisation into disrepute. That was wrong. The blame lay with the markets men who left us to find our own way back from Le Mans." During research, I did come across another source stating that 2 members of the IRA bombing team were double agents working for RUC Special Branch, with one of them being Dennis Donaldson, who I mentioned in the previous episode and was killed in 2006 in Donegal. This attack was a major disaster for the Provisional IRA, who always denied being sectarian. But on this night, the people killed were Protestant civilians with no ties to the security services whatsoever. There was no way to justify these killings. The IRA in Dublin were also furious and called for a full investigation into the bombing. Ed Maloney writes in the book A Secret History of the IRA that in the wake of the Le Mans bombing, the Chief of Staff of the Provisional IRA, whom I cannot name, had to step down, as Le Mans had happened under his watch, and it was also under his watch that the IRA had approved of the use of these incendiary-style bombs. He was replaced by Martin McGuinness, who remained Chief of Staff of the Provisional IRA for 4 years. In the months following Le Mans, the Provisional IRA were quiet, and these incendiary attacks virtually ceased. But by November 1978, things began to ramp up again, and gradually this atrocity was replaced by others. In 2012, a report into the bombing was released by the Historical Inquiries team, which stated that many police documents, including interviews with IRA members, had been lost to time. But critics believe that documents were removed to protect IRA members. The report was heavily criticised by victims' families, saying it offered little to no new information and just raised more new questions. Isabel Huddleston was the owner of the Le Mans Hotel and was not sure what to do in the aftermath of this bombing. The hotel was almost completely destroyed in the bomb, but the family did decide to rebuild. But they were faced with the dilemma, as the Le Mans name would forever be associated with this bombing. Should they keep the original name? They decided to respect the history of the hotel and keep the original name. And as of writing, the Le Mans Hotel and Country Club is still open and thriving. After the Le Mans bombing, many survivors left Northern Ireland never to return. Some went to Canada, some went to Great Britain. They simply couldn't live here after what happened. Other survivors of the attack spent years campaigning for an inquest or public inquiry. And in 2018, a memorial service was held, marking 40 years since the bomb. It was decided that this would be the final memorial service held for the victims. Andrea Nelson and her sister were left orphaned after their parents Paul and Dorothy were killed in the blast. They ended up moving over to England. When asked if she feels bitterness towards the bombers, Andrea had this to say.
I don't feel any anger or bitterness or hatred, mainly because If I felt that anger, it would take something away from my life. And I want to live my life to the full now. And I feel that they would actually be hurting me more by making me feel bitter for the rest of my life.
As of writing, it is unclear if victims' families will ever receive the inquiry that they are owed, or if this bombing will become one of the many where victims' families continue their tireless pursuit for justice. I think we'll leave it there for now. Thanks, and see you next time.